Testament, as it was written, was very much something set in history. It's probably as unique as any other sort of religious experience because it's clearly set in history, and it's set in history within a short period of time. And we have to have a sense of what's happening with the history. And there's many different parts to this. But we must understand that the New Testament writings, when you look at this, when you look at its overall structure, was influenced by its history and by its location. We must understand that what we see within particularly all of the biblical writings, including the New Testament, is these are some of the earliest forms of history writing that we have down in terms of evidence. Particularly true within the Hebrew Testament. We see a lot of this in terms of being some of the earliest history writing, because it's writing not just a set of facts, but with a point of view. And what we see here within the New Testament is that this also gives you a tremendous amount of documentary evidence. Because if you think about it, we actually have more documentary evidence for the life of Jesus than we do for Alexander the Great. It was only like 300 years earlier. And you might go, but wait, we know that's a historical figure. And there's obviously many things more we can say about that, but it turns out that it's really pretty powerful what we can actually put together there. And so there's no way to get around the fact when you look at the New Testament and the way that the people at the time looked at it and the way that we properly looking at it, we have to have history as a key aspect and understanding what's going on here. And understand that the early followers of Jesus, after his life on earth, claimed that the resurrection was a historical event. Did not claim it was a story. Did not claim it was a legend. And this continued for many, many, many centuries, and really only became questioned really in the last couple centuries at all. Sort of with the age of sort of modernity and looking at the age of the Enlightenment. So we have to understand that there's some interesting pieces of this that we always need to kind of keep in balance. Now, it's also true, unfortunately, we don't have any of the original versions of the original New Testament writing. We do have several second century documents and things that push to the edge, but we don't have the originals. And it would be wonderful if we did. It's clear we don't because we have many, many different copies, of which all the copies are really close, but there's some subtle differences even in their original Greek. So these are things that need to be sort of understood and paid attention to as you dig through this. But as you look at the history, and I want you to kind of think about how it began. I mean, obviously the birth of Jesus we know is roughly about 4 to 5 BC. Kind of unfortunate. We didn't quite know how to get it to 0, but such is life of dealing with trying to get calendars. It's still it's still a pretty good guess. Jesus probably lived until the early 30s. More than likely, there's a couple things that kind of anchor when Passion Week likely occurred. It's clear that the resurrection of Jesus sort of changed the entire perspective of how everybody looked at history back before it. And then you ask, well, what documents do we have, and roughly when do we have a sense of when they were written? Because as you look at the New Testament documents, you kind of want to kind of know that as well as what else was happening that was significant. And arguably one of the major events that sets all of this is the Jewish revolt, going between roughly about 66 to 70, and obviously there's some stuff happening beforehand and a lot of sort of churning in the water until you got to 70, where the entire Jewish state was wiped out by the Romans. And this is very important in terms of understanding some parts of this structurally. Now, if we look at some of these various aspects, what we begin to realize is, well, when were things written? Well, arguably, probably some of the earliest books written were things like 1 Thessalonians, Galatians, 1 Corinthians. Letters to Paul to the churches in Thessalonica, Galatia, and also first letter to Corinth. And these are fairly early, and something that's worth noting is notice how close these conversations are to the resurrection and the resurrection time frame. It's within 20 years, roughly. And that's close enough for people to still have a tremendous number of eyewitnesses and people to still be very, very affected by all of this. And then we see things in terms of Romans. There's the book of Philemon, Ephesians, Colossians, which likely came together. Some people have different opinions. This is why there's kind of a bar, because there's debates among where things might sit. Most people for 1 Thessalonians, Galatians, and Corinthians kind of pretty much agree where those sit. Interestingly enough, all of the Gospels were pretty much written a bit later. Mark being the earliest one, and again, there's sort of a bar here because there's a different scholarly opinion on this. For Mark, could be anywhere from starting, 60 on, past 70. But usually the order is understood that usually it's Mark, then Matthew, then Luke, and then John. John probably being the one that's clearly outside of, after the Jewish revolt. The others not so clear in where they sit. And then there's a set of other letters that show up later and afterwards. But it's interesting to kind of get a sense of it. And there's a scholarly debate and scholarly trying to ringing through this. But it does matter a little bit of where you think you place these, because that also will have an impact on how you interpret what you're seeing out of those writings. And one of the big things that comes out very quickly as soon as you start talking about historical discussions is for Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John, is, are you allowed to predict something? Are miracles allowed to be considered historical, or do we consider miracles as an indication that it clearly had to have been written after something that was being predicted? Classic case with Mark and Matthew and Luke is that there is a prediction of the fall of the temple in Jerusalem, which of course happens right around here. Where that sits has a huge implication on certain theological questions. And the question then comes right down to, well, can that document have been written and predicting what would happen? And to what extent, and how do I approach that? This becomes immediately a question that shows up in how you talk about the various implications and aspects. But no matter how you look at this, it's important to be aware of the history and aware that the New Testament is very much a document written in history, claiming to be part of history, and that the resurrection was something that is in part of history.